Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is criminal defense lawyer Kyla Lee. Kyla, who works for Acumen Law Corporation in Vancouver, focuses on drinking and driving offenses. She's also the host of a web series and of a podcast called Driving Law. Kyla is a former model and recently fulfilled one of her childhood dreams when her children's book was published in 2023. Kyla, thanks so much for joining us this week on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
Well, let's start with your law career. Was practicing law something you knew you wanted to do at a pretty young age?
Oh, for sure. I think my mom says that I came out of the womb a lawyer. I was always arguing and debating when I was a kid. I was always really interested in justice and social activism and people's rights and violations of rights. And so, as long as I can remember, I wanted to be a lawyer, and I lived my entire life working towards that goal.
I guess, what did you do working towards that goal?
Well, my earliest memory is walking with my grandma. We would walk to church just down from her house, and I looked up at her and I said, "Grandy, when I grow up, I want to be a lawyer." And I remember getting really stressed in elementary school, if I got a low grade on a math test or something like that, because I thought I wouldn't get into law school because of my elementary school math test grades. And nobody, I guess, had the heart to tell me that does not matter. So, obviously I went through regular school, I graduated high school, I applied to university. And I took a number of courses that I thought would prepare me for the law career I wanted. And in particular, I really wanted, when I started my interaction with the law, I wanted to go into Indigenous law and work on land claims and treaty rights. And so I did my undergrad, I did my bachelor's degree in the First Nations Studies program at UBC. I think it's now called the Indigenous Studies program. And then from there, I applied to law school and took a number of Indigenous law courses, but I kind of fell in love with criminal law. So I changed my sort of career goals within the legal profession, but still could not give up that become a lawyer dream.
Pretty awesome that you knew so young. So many of us, it's later in life when we discover these things. Like you mentioned, a lot of Indigenous people do want to go into Indigenous law and rights, things like that. What was it, I guess, that made you switch over?
It was a bunch of things. Part of it is kind of just my desire to be entertained by the work that I do. And as I learned more about how land claims and treaty rights cases were dealt with, I realized that I would probably spend my entire career working on maybe one or two cases, because it just takes that long for these cases to go through the courts and to be resolved. And I didn't really like the idea of only working on a very small number of cases. And I thought criminal law was a way that I could interact with Indigenous people. I could also satisfy my desire for protecting the rights of individuals and challenging police and state actions at the same time as doing something that had sort of a lot of volume and turnover to keep me interested and keep the facts interesting. So that's sort of why the switch, primarily just because of the speed of the profession.
Of course, we don't want all Indigenous lawyers to be going into land claims, things like that. We want them spread out through the system. So how do you hope having more Indigenous lawyers, spread throughout the system will make things more equitable?
Oh, there are lots of ways that having more Indigenous lawyers is going to make the system better. First of all, cultural competency when dealing with Indigenous clients and Indigenous communities has been a huge failing of the legal profession. We finally now, this is the first year, that lawyers in British Columbia are required to take a cultural competency course as part of their professional development. And if you don't take it, you can be sanctioned by the Law Society. So that's a good step. But also having people who are from Indigenous communities be lawyers and work outside of Indigenous law also helps to break down sort of barriers, right? When I was in law school and I was, doing Indigenous legal courses and being Indigenous in law school, people sort of just assumed that that's where I would end up, was in Indigenous law, because you're taking the courses, you are Métis, so therefore you should go in this area. And it almost felt like a little bit of predetermination of what I should be doing, as opposed to letting me make my own decisions about what I found the most fulfilling or what I thought would be the most interesting for me. And I think seeing Indigenous people who are real estate lawyers and who are civil litigation lawyers and who do wills and estates and all sorts of areas of law tells young Indigenous people who are looking for role models, look, you can be anything you want to be, and then within that profession you can do anything you want to do, and there's no barriers facing you just because you're Indigenous. There's no required pathway that you have to follow. Do what makes you happy. The world is and should be your oyster.
Awesome stuff. Well, speaking of being a role model, you support one Allard School of Law student each year through the Kyla Lee Indigenous Law Students Award. Can you tell us about that and why it's important to you to support an Indigenous law student?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I received a lot of support as a student. There were a lot of bursaries that I applied for that helped me to pay for my school. I didn't have, my parents didn't pay for law school. I didn't have a lot of money. I don't come from a wealthy family. So having access to bursaries was really important. But I always felt a little bit stigmatized. Because in university, there's a difference between an award and a bursary. And a bursary is based on your need. So essentially, if you get a bursary, yes, you have to have good academic performance and you have to qualify, and usually there's some requirements, but you also have to be in need of the money. And so when you put it on your resume and you're applying for jobs and people see that you had bursaries, it tells people that you got money not just because you did well, but also because you needed it. Whereas with an award or a scholarship, it's based on your academic performance, your achievement, and your accomplishments. It's just based on celebrating what you've done. And I really struggled with that. I felt very stigmatized by it, and I felt it wasn't fair, because for a lot of people who come from wealthy families, who have support paying their tuition, who have family members who are lawyers, who are not coming from small communities and are established in the community where they're going to law school, they have the network in place to study really hard, to get the good grades. I was working 5 jobs while I was going to school full time. It was hard, and I wanted to create an award that would recognize Indigenous students, but also recognize the reality for most Indigenous students in law school, which is that you also have to be working and you aren't getting a lot of support from family. And there's all sorts of sort of life pressures. A lot of Indigenous students are parents and they have to raise their children. And so you have all of these demands outside of law school that other students aren't facing. And I wanted somebody to be recognized as getting through law school with all of that going on around you is in and of itself an achievement, and for it to be an award and not a bursary. So that was my motivation behind it.
Awesome stuff. It took me a decade to pay off my student loans. I couldn't imagine be still paying off law school right now if I went that way. What advice do you have for Indigenous law students or those that are looking to get into law?
I mean, do it. A lot of people say don't. A lot of people will say that, law is not a great career. I don't agree. I think that, you can get into law and you have so many pathways available to you to do good for yourself, to do good for your community, to do good for the world, or to just have a job that makes you a decent living as well, right? You don't have to want to do it for altruistic reasons. And it is also something that opens a lot of doors for you. It's not, people think about going to law school and getting a law degree as becoming a lawyer, but I have people I went to law school with, one of whom is working, my friend, she works at UBC. She's actually running an Indigenous department in one of the areas of UBC. I have colleagues that I went to law school with who run farms now, or who are dealing with economic development for their First Nation. They're not lawyering, but they're using the skills that they got in law school to do interesting other careers. And I just think that the idea of getting a degree that opens that many doors for you is definitely worth pursuing if you can.
Absolutely. Kyla, much more to talk about here, but we have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with lawyer and author Kyla Lee. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is criminal defense lawyer and author Kyla Lee. Kyla, we're talking about why you got into law before the break, but you specialize in driving under the influence charges and challenge them in court. Can you tell us about that work and why you focus on that?
It was a little bit of a happy accident. When I was applying for jobs, I applied at criminal law firms and just anywhere that did criminal law. And I got hired at a firm that dealt primarily with these types of cases. And I realized that I really enjoyed the work. It's not just the law and like police stops and police interactions with people. It's also like science, how breathalyzers work, how roadside sobriety testing works, blood testing. I just did a lengthy trial with lots of evidence about how blood tests are done. So you get this really neat intersection of like science and the law and people's rights. And in almost every case, I get to argue that the police violated my client's rights, that the law is somehow invalid or that the law was applied incorrectly. So I feel like I'm defending people, and defending people not just against a criminal charge, but defending people against police overactions and police misconduct most of the time. So this is weird to say, but it's really fulfilling.
Right. Are there any cases so far in your career that stand out for you?
Oh gosh, lots. Probably the biggest one for me is the first time, the only time, that I went to the Supreme Court of Canada, just because that's like a milestone for young lawyers to get permission to go to the court and then to get to be lead counsel on a case like that. So that was huge for me. I've also, I've got fond memories of like the first trial I did where I won. I had a case I did many years ago now on Haida Gwaii, where I got to spend a long time up there dealing with issues between the police and the local community that were affecting the community. And I felt really good about that case because not only did I get to spend time in a really beautiful community, but I got to do something that I think had some positive impacts ultimately for the community. I met amazing people. And so yeah, just things like that. I think the cases that stick with me the most are the ones where my clients have impacted me, or I felt like the decisions that I got from the court have impacted people's rights for the better in Canada.
Nice. I think a lot of people might be familiar with your name or face from social media. You have a pretty significant following, over 100,000 followers over multiple platforms. How's that going for you? It's
a big time suck, but I like it. I feel like a responsibility because I have all of this power as a lawyer to try and make the law more accessible for people. And I think that's a real failing of the legal profession, is that lawyers tend to hold themselves out as quite above everything else, above the fray, we often say. And the problem with that is that we don't seem accessible to members of the general public, to people who are looking for a lawyer. You don't think that your lawyer is going to be like some, fun, approachable person who understands you on a human level and who is human. And I wanted to break down that stigma. So I started getting on social media. I started just tweeting out whatever came into my head about like news stories and government regulations and new legislation. And now I'm on TikTok making videos and responding to things. And I think it's helping people connect with legal advice and information. I get messages all the time from people who say, I didn't know this, and I saw your video and the information you gave me really helped me. And I thought, there's one person who got some free legal advice or information, who was able to get it in an accessible fashion, and they feel more confident in their life now because of that. So I feel an obligation to do it because I think I'm helping people.
Yeah, you know, a lot of lawyers are media adverse, don't want to talk to the media, don't like the media, or try to use the media in whichever way they can. No offense to my many lawyer friends out there, but you know, do you feel some sort of like, do a lot of people reach out to you for advice, and do you feel like you have to give good advice?
Well, I mean, I always feel like I have to give good advice because there are professional consequences if I don't. You know, I could be sued even if it's somebody messaging me on a social media platform. It's still potentially engaging my professional responsibility. So I do feel the need to give good advice. And I do feel, like a responsibility to fill the gap by media-averse lawyers and to be accessible to people who don't view lawyers as being accessible. So I'm like actually terrible at responding to DMs because I get a lot of them, but I try to set aside like one day a month where I go through my inbox and catch up on everything.
Have you ever gotten into trouble over any of that? Like you say, there's consequences for sure, and when you've got that many followers.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be very careful about things that I say and how I say them because the Law Society has a lot of rules about marketing. And so even if I'm just like on social media and I'm talking about information, they consider that to be marketing and advertising my services. So I have to be very careful that I'm not doing anything that's contrary to the best interests of the public, that would call into question the administration of justice, that would make lawyers look bad generally. And of course, I also have to make sure that when I'm advising people, I'm advising them within my ethical boundaries. And a lot of times, like messages that I'll get are people who are maybe looking for information about how to facilitate criminal activity, how to get away with crimes. I can't advise on that. I can advise on how to assert and exercise your rights, but I can't take that next step into telling you how to get away with doing something illegal.
Wow, yeah, no kidding. I think I'd probably just stay off social media altogether. But you also have a...
Well, that might be the fear that... Oh.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say that might be the fear that a lot of lawyers have about engaging with the media and engaging with social media is because there are so many restrictions on what we can say and can do and how we can communicate with people. I think a lot of people are just a little bit afraid because they don't want to be accused of crossing one of those lines and have to go through the whole process that happens as a result of it.
You also have a web series and a podcast, also not really old stock lawyer type of stuff. What do you like about those mediums to get your thoughts across?
I liked my web series. I do a web series called Cases That Should Have Gone to the Supreme Court of Canada but Didn't. And I liked it because I think it emphasized for people the importance of some of the issues that the Supreme Court of Canada is being asked to consider, and also the difficulty with bringing a case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada and getting it litigated there and getting it heard. How many hurdles do you have to jump through for that? Because a lot of people say, oh, you know, this should go to the Supreme Court of Canada, or this isn't fair, or this isn't right. But being able to sort of educate the public with my series on that, about how hard it is, I think helps people to understand a little bit more why we aren't seeing a ton of judgments on what people perceive to be important issues. And the podcast, I don't know, I just had a desire to do a podcast one day, and now I've trapped myself in a cycle of having to release an episode every week. So it's good though. It's about driving law, and driving law, what I like about it is it's an area of law that most people at some point in their life are going to interact with the state through their driving, whether it's, you know, a suspension of your driver's license, whether it's getting a traffic ticket, whether it's getting some sort of an impaired driving allegation, or whether it's even just going through a roadblock and having the police officer shine the flashlight in your window and ask you if you've been drinking. And so there's so much involved in the law around driving that impacts people that I think there's like a never-ending series of conversations that we can have about it.
Well, you have many other endeavors as well. We're going to talk about those. We just have to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Kyla Lee. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Kyla Lee, a lawyer and an author that we're going to speak about here soon. Previously, you were also a model, Kyla. Can you tell us a bit about that experience?
I mean, it was a way partly to pay the bills while I was in school. I made a little bit of money from it, and that was good. And I also just really liked having sort of a creative outlet to express myself in a way that was kind of unconventional.
At no point were you thinking, forget law school, I'll just stick with this modeling thing?
I was never tall enough or really thin enough to not go to law school and do modeling full time. You have to be like at least 5'9" to really succeed, and I'm only 5'7", so on a 5'7" with a little bit of flexibility on the number there.
Right. Well, you're also an author. Can you tell us a bit about Sit Still Jackson?
This was a children's book that was inspired by my niece. I was trying to do some work and she was hanging around me and moving around all the time, and I was thinking, man, she's really distracting me. I wonder what lie I could tell her to make her sit still. And I started thinking, oh, maybe if I told her that if she sat very still, she would grow really big and tall and strong. And that's sort of how this idea for the story came to me. The story's about a boy who is always squirming around. He gets told he'll get big and strong if he sits still, so he takes it to the extreme degree, sits still for days, and grows so tall that he can't interact with his friends or his family anymore. He gets really lonely, and he has to figure out how to get back to his regular size so that he can live his life again.
I'd read that writing is something that you wanted to do since you were young. Did you know it would be a children's book?
I tried to write children's books and submit them to publishers when I was like 8. And they wrote me the nicest rejection letters back. I had like drawings. I wrote all sorts of stuff when I was young and tried to get published. But unfortunately, publishers don't actually take you seriously when you write by hand in pencil in a notebook and mail it to them.
Your mom, who knew that you wanted to be a lawyer and an author at such a young age, must be pretty proud of you the way you're living out these dreams now.
I think she is. I hope so. My parents have always been really supportive, and they've always told me that I can do anything I want as long as I put my mind to it, which has caused some chaos.
Well, now that you've been published, do you plan to write more, or have you been writing more?
I do intend to write more. I'm in the beginning stages of working on a novel, but that'll probably take years to actually finish and then shop around for publication. But I enjoy writing. I enjoy, again, being creative and exercising my creative skills in that way. So I want to keep doing it, and hopefully I can make it into something that keeps me occupied.
Well, sounds like you must be pretty occupied. I'm glad, Kyla, that between your webcast and your podcast and lawyering and writing books that you had some time for us this week on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this.
Well, we did too. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this week's show. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. Or you can also head on over to the APTN News YouTube page. You'll find 10 years worth of episodes over there. This episode and all of our previous episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those wherever you download your Kyla Lee podcasts and any other podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us this week on Face to Face. We will see you back here in 7 days.